Okay, let's talk a little bit about Abram. Genesis 13. We start by reading it. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. He went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been in the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he made there formerly. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. And the land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling then in the land. So Abram said to Lot, Please, let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right, or if to the right, then I will go to the left. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, Now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise and walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Okay, let's talk about, again, the example of Abraham. That's where I'm going to focus. And then the story of Israel, and then the encounter with Christ. So the example of Abraham. This is a story of restoration. We begin with this. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. So remember the background. We just came from chapter 12, where Abram and Sarai and Lot went down to Egypt because of the famine. But while they were there, instead of just trusting God to take care of him, Abram kind of faltered in his walk of faith. And he tried to arrange some sneaky thing where he would call Sarah his sister, and then he wouldn't be in danger if she was taken by Pharaoh. And then she was taken by Pharaoh. And Pharaoh eventually found out and then sort of reproved Abram, was like, why did you do this to me? And he said, get out. And so they had to go back. But in the process, it was weird. Abram actually prospered. He got all this silver and gold, but his relationship with God did not prosper. His relationship with God was temporarily interrupted by this because he wasn't walking in faith during that time. He was walking in doubt, in the sense that he was trying to arrange for himself how to keep himself protected instead of relying on God to do it. And so that's the first thing. In Egypt, Abram had prospered financially, but had not been living by faith. I don't know why that says had not been living by faith. Okay. And then something very interesting happens. He went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been in the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he'd made there formerly. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. This is very interesting. It says he went back from Egypt, back to the Negev, but he went back to the place he'd been at the very beginning when he first started this whole thing. And he went back to the place where he'd built the altar. What he's doing is he's coming back to remembering what he was trusting God to do, and what God had promised him, and that he was walking by faith, and that he was worshiping God. And there again, he calls on the name of the Lord. So he comes back to the very beginning. It's like he says, I know I'd taken a wrong turn. Let me go back and remember how I used to trust God. Let me go back and remember how I was depending on him. And let me start over. And maybe he'll let me start over. And so what we see is that in this chapter, it's about the restoration of Abram's relationship with God. There were no altars being built in Egypt, but now he goes back to worship to an altar. And then the next thing that happens, so I just want to point out the place where his tent had been in the beginning. He goes back to what was I believing in before I went astray? Where was I with God before I took a wrong turn? If God brings us back from a wrong turn, this is the right thing. We should go back to where we were. We should go back to the last thing we remember obeying, the last thing we remember trusting, and move on from there. And it was the place where he worshiped before. We should go back to the place of worship, the place of trust, the place of relationship with God. And there we should call upon God again and say, I'm coming back to you, God. I want to walk with you again. Okay, the next part of the chapter says it talks about the strife between Abram and Lot. And what this is, it's like another test. It's like God says, okay, you didn't believe me when you went to Egypt, and now you're back. Let me give you another test and see, do you believe me now? And this time, we'll talk about it in a few minutes, and this time Abram does pass the test. And at the very end of the chapter, we get this phrase. Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. So earlier, he came back to the altar he had built before and worshiped God there. Now he passes this test, so to speak, grows in faith, continues to walk in faith. He settles in a new place, and again, immediately builds an altar so that he can worship God. This time, the altar, Abram responds in faith, and actually, we'll come back to that later. But I just want you to notice how this chapter is bookended by altars. It's bookended by worship. It's bookended by a relationship with God, which is thriving and dynamic and going and working. And he's walking in it now. So this is a restoration from Egypt. Let's take a look at more details. I want to look at this test. After he'd come back to Bethel, come back to worship, come back to trust in God, called upon the name of the Lord again, immediately, or at least soon, God gives him a chance to put his money where his mouth is, because he brings up a test. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, and the land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. So the first thing is, the land couldn't sustain them. Now, the last time when they went to Egypt, there was a famine in the land, and so the land couldn't sustain them. This time there's no famine, but they're just so big that the land couldn't sustain them. And he's faced with kind of the same situation. Is he going to take matters into his own hands and just try to fix this on his own, or is he going to just trust God this time? And furthermore, there's strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. In other words, they were fighting over rivers and water, or they were fighting over the best grass, or they were fighting over the place to put their livestock. And there's just not enough there for both groups of people and for all the livestock. And so there's a problem here. And to make it worse, it throws this little sentence here in. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling then in the land. It's just a reminder to us that even though God had promised this land to Abram, he had not yet given it to him. Abram was just taking this by faith. It was in the future going to be given to him. Right now, they didn't own the land. If they had owned the land and it had been theirs, they could have just expanded into the rest of the land. But they couldn't, because there were Canaanites and Perizzites living there. They didn't have unlimited space. And so these three things, the land couldn't sustain them. There was strife between the two different groups of herdsmen, and there were other people living around the land, made it kind of an untenable situation. So Abram comes up with a solution, but this time the solution is one that really comes from faith. It comes from trusting that God will work out how to keep the promise, and Abram doesn't have to make it happen. Abram said to Lot, look, please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we're brothers. I'll tell you what, I'll give you half the land. He says, is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, I will go to the right, or if to the right, then I will go to the left. He says, I want to just say, take what you need. Don't fight with me over it. I'll take the other part, and then we'll just live separately where we'll have enough room and we shouldn't have strife anymore. And interestingly, in order to make this happen, he lets Lot have first choice. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord. I think he means like Eden. Like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. I don't know what that's like, but apparently it was really rich and well watered. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. It's kind of interesting. Abram is like, I just don't want there to be strife. Take whatever you want. And Lot's like, oh, good, I'll take the best land. I would have thought maybe he would divide it north and south, so he'd say we both get some of the good land and some of the bad land. But he's like, nope, if you're going to give me the best, I'll take it. And at this point, the problems of strife are solved. But I think there'd be a question from a human point of view, did Abram just mess up his promise? Is God has he lost out now because he's given half of his land away to Lot? Abram could have fought for his right to the land, but instead he just said, well, God's going to have to take care of that because I need to figure out how to get along with my brother, and I need to separate from him and just trust that God will do this somehow. So he just trusted God to see the fulfillment of the promise. Did Abraham lose out by doing that? No. And that's what the rest of the chapter is showing, for a couple different reasons. First of all, because Lot did not get as good a deal as he thought. It says, Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley, and removed his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly, and sinners against the Lord. Now this is just foreshadowing. Later on, we hear everything that happens with Sodom and Gomorrah. At this point, it looks like Lot has got a great deal. He's got this wonderful land, and he's near these big cities, which gives him sort of access to all that comes with the big city. And it looks like a great deal. But they're so wicked that Lot has essentially put himself in the camp of the people that God is planning on judging. And it's bad for him. It's bad spiritually for him. It's bad for his future. In a way, God was protecting Abram by keeping him out of this area. So Lot took it. God was actually steering him to the place he needed to be. So that's the first thing. It looks like he lost out, but he didn't, because God knows the future. And God also cares about the hearts and the wickedness and righteousness of the people around him. And that should be factored in. So God protected Abram from consequences he didn't even see. I don't have this on my notes, but I wonder, he keeps saying here that Lot was separated from Abram. I wonder if God was also protecting Abram by separating him from Lot. Lot wasn't necessarily even invited in the first place by God when he said, go out into Canaan. Abram just took him. And here it talks about after he was separated from Lot, that's when God reaffirmed the promise. So I wonder if Lot himself had been a bad influence. Maybe he was behind the move to Egypt. Maybe there were other things going on. We don't know that. It doesn't say that. Later on, it certainly looks like he's not a great influence. But I wonder if God was protecting Abram by keeping him away from Sodom and also separating him from Lot. But there's more. Because God specifically reaffirms, you are not going to lose anything of what I've promised you. Did Abraham lose out by doing this? The Lord said to Abram, notice, after Lot had separated from him, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. He says, don't be deceived by this, or don't worry about it. I am going to fully give you all the land I promised you, and it's going to be everything you can see. You're not going to lose out one bit here. And then he reaffirms the promise about descendants too. He says, I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. He means they're going to be so many that'll be as many as the dust of the earth. It'll be countless. There'll be millions. And then he says, arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. He's sort of like saying, test me on this. Go around, look, as far as you can go. That's still part of the inheritance. You're getting it all. And so he's reaffirming to him, you have not lost out. You can still trust me. Notice, by the way, that he says northward and southward and eastward and westward. East is the direction Lot went. So maybe not all the way to Sodom and Gomorrah sites, but at least to some degree, he gets even the land that's eastward of where they are. So God reaffirms the promise to him and says, you were right to trust me. You have not lost out. And then he says that this phrase that I just read, arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. And it's interesting. He didn't just reaffirm it. He had Abram do something. He said, I want you to get up and walk around. I want you to get up and travel through the land. Not because you're going to conquer it. Not because you're walking through the land somehow claims it for you or anything, but because I want you to see what I'm talking about. I want you to let it settle in that I really mean to give you all of this. And so why did God ask him to do this? He wanted him to spend enough time to settle into the promise and really believe it. So I have found that at times in my life, this is what God does. He's promised me something in Scripture and that I have just begun to believe, but I don't see the extent of it. And it's like he'll say in prayer, not that I have to rise and physically walk around, but I kind of spiritually or mentally need to walk around. And he'll say, I want you to really think about what I'm promising you here. I want you to see the full extent of what these verses are telling you. I want you to see the full extent of how deeply you can trust me and how much of your life this extends into. I think he knows we need to not only be promised that he needs to not only reaffirm his promises to us, but he needs us to actively look and settle into what have we been given and in Christ. And then it says, then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. When I first read this, I thought, wait, he's moving. But he didn't. He only moved about 35 miles away from where he had been. He moved because Abram and he had split up Lot, and he had split up the land. Lot went one direction. He's moving further west in the other direction and a little bit south. to Mamre. That's still right in the center of the promised land. And there again, now that he's moved, he's away from his altar, so he builds another altar. So at the beginning and end of this chapter, Abram's making sure he has altars. At the beginning and end of this chapter, Abram's making sure he can worship God and give his life to God and surrender to God. So we see right away again that this is about a restored relationship, a restored walk of faith with God. Okay. So this time the altar signifies Abram's trust in God's promise going forward. Last time it kind of signified his trust in God's promise back then. Okay. Let's talk briefly about the story of Israel. I just have a little bit to say on this, not a lot. And we're going to see some of what I'm seeing here we're going to talk about perhaps later in other chapters. But I just want to think about Israel and the Promised Land. So when the Israelites in the Old Testament would read this chapter, I think what happens is when they read the story of Abram, they don't just think Abram. They think about themselves as they would have thought about themselves as the people of God. Because this chapter is about Abram having a reaffirmation, a reconfirmation of God's promise to give them the land. And they would have been thinking, that's our land. That's the land that we've been promised. And we can see how it was reconfirmed to Abram. But notice they can also see here how it wasn't fulfilled immediately. Abram was in the land, but he hadn't yet conquered it. The Canaanite and the Perizzite was still there. And he had this squabble with Lot, and it looked like he was losing it. And then God says, don't worry, I will give it to you. And they would have been thinking about how it was promised, but Abram didn't have it yet, but he did eventually get it. And they would have known, because they know the rest of the story, that it took 400 years before that land was finally given to Israel. It took 400 years. And by the time they came out of the Exodus in Egypt and went into the Promised Land, by that point, God was ready to judge Canaan. And so their taking the land from Canaan matched the timing of God's being ready to judge them. It wasn't just, we're going to go declare war on who's ever there. It was God saying, these are the people, now take it from them because this is part of my judgment on them. And so it was fulfilled, but he gave the promise 400 years early. Now that would have been significant for Israel because the same thing happens a little bit later, because eventually they got carried into exile by Assyria and by Babylon. And then they came back from exile, but then they got conquered again by Greece and by Rome. And by the time we get to the time of Jesus, they are in their land, but they don't really own it because the Romans own them. And they're still looking to have the land. They're still looking forward to getting the land. And then in 70 AD, the whole Jerusalem is all wiped out. And they go centuries without having much of a land of their own. And now we come to our day. And they have a land of their own, established in 1948 after World War II, but there's all sorts of battling over it and all sorts of struggles over it. There's two different groups of people living in that area, Palestine and Israel, and it's an issue. So how do we see all that politically in light of the scriptures? First of all, we recognize that the greatest fulfillment of getting the land is not now. It's in the future still. Even if something's happened in 1948, that isn't the fulfillment the scripture is looking for. It's looking for something much bigger and much greater than that, still to come when Jesus returns. So even today, Israel's still waiting for the fullness of the promise. It would be a mistake to see what's happening now as the complete fulfillment of Israel getting their own land back. Matter of fact, Jesus explicitly says, Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, you can do your own study on this and see what you think, but I believe the times of the Gentiles clearly extend at least as far as the tribulation and the end of the tribulation. The Antichrist is like the ultimate picture of the times of the Gentiles. And all through that time, Israel will still be persecuted and under great pressure and under great suffering because of the nations around them attacking them and attacking their belief in God. But when Jesus comes back at the end of the tribulation, that's when they will be given the fullness of the land and the meek will inherit the earth. So until then, it still hasn't completely happened. What that means, but that also means this. I won't say much more about this, and you can sort of work it out for yourself and see if you think I'm correct. But it seems to me that means I can believe in Israel, and I can believe in the future of Israel, and I can believe that those who bless Israel will be blessed and those who curse Israel will be cursed. And in that sense, I can fully support Israel. But it doesn't mean I have to believe that everything they're going to eventually have is theirs now. And it also doesn't mean that I have to believe that everything they do is correct. So two different Christians can disagree on the situation with Palestine and with Gaza. They can disagree about whether Israel's doing the right thing or the wrong thing or some of each, and still fully both support Israel. Because supporting Israel doesn't mean whatever Israel decides to do as a nation is from God. Because sometimes in the past, Israel is disobeying God. It doesn't mean whatever's blessing on Israel will happen. That will eventually be true, but maybe not now, because right now we're in the times of the Gentiles and God's still bringing judgment on Israel until they turn to the Messiah. So we should still be those who bless Israel, but we need to recognize that that doesn't mean we have to take a particular political stand on Israel and Gaza and Palestine and Hamas and everything else. I do think I disagree with the world stand on this in a lot of ways, but I also think it's important for us to recognize we can take different views on this depending on what we think the facts support and still be believing in the primacy of Israel and the promises that have been made to Israel. You can think about that, and if you disagree with me, feel free to share it with me and try to change my mind about that. But in the meantime, let's go back to the question of Israel seeing the promised land here and being encouraged by what it tells us. Notice that Lot seemed to take the best part, but it was a land marked for judgment, and God calls us to find our blessing in him and not the world, what the world has to offer. They would read this about Lot going into Sodom and Abram taking the other part, and they would be reminded by that God calls them to turn away from the wealth and the prosperity of the nations who forget God and focus on what they have in him. And then when Abram was told, arise, walk around and believe, basically, they would be encouraged by that themselves to trust that God has their very best interests at heart. Okay, let's talk about the encounter with Christ. I don't see a specific encounter with Christ in this chapter, like I do in some, but it certainly points to something about Christ, which is important. And that's the idea I've been talking about. It points to Christ as our restorer. If you need to, you can see the altars themselves as a picture of Christ being our means of restoration. But I don't think that's really the emphasis here. But the point is, we see Christ's restoration here just in the openness of just in the fact that God restores his relationship with Abram. So let's talk a little bit about Christ being a restorer. First of all, God himself, through the prophets, speaks to Israel many different times about being a restorer. He says in Joel 2, I'm going to make up to you for the years that the swarming locust has eaten. I brought my judgment on you. The locust has eaten everything, and then there will be a day when I'll make up for it all, and I'll restore you to everything you once had. Another place he talks about the Messiah, and who says in prophecy, the Lord has anointed me to appoint them that mourn in Zion, to give them beauty for ashes. This is in the King James Version that it says this. And so the idea is you've had ashes of repentance, ashes of mourning, but you're going to have beauty one day to correspond to that and to make up for it. So God is a God who restores with Israel. And another place he says, just a verse later, he says, they will rebuild the ancient ruins. They will raise up the former devastations. They will repair the ruined cities, the desolations of many generations. So even in this very early story, at the very beginning of Israel with Abram's life, we see God restoring Abram, even if it's his own fault that he's fallen away. And we see throughout their history, he keeps saying, I'm going to restore you as a nation, even if it's your own fault you fell away. The same thing, though, is true specifically with Jesus when he arrives on the scene. We see Jesus saying something about Zacchaeus, like, for the Son of Man has come. Why? To seek and to save that which was lost. He's saying Zacchaeus was meant to be following me and in a relationship with our Father, but he wandered away from that. And I've come to seek and save that which is lost. And he gives also the parable of the lost coin or the lost sheep or the prodigal son. There was something that was dear to somebody and they lost it and they sought until they find it. This is a picture of Christ as our restorer. And then there's one picture about Christ being restoring somebody after their faith had failed that I really want to point out to you. This is such a deep and meaningful verse for me. I'm going to start with another part of the chapter. I'm going to start with a passage where Peter had just denied the Lord. And I want to set the scene and get you to think about this moment right here in these verses. Peter just finished denying Christ, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he told him, before a rooster crows today, you'll deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. And I want you to capture in your imagination that moment where he's weeping bitterly and what he's feeling. On the one hand, he'd been so sure he would never deny Christ, because he was thinking, I'm the courageous one. I'm the one who walked out on the water. I'm the one who's always jumping up to try everything. And I don't back down from this. I might not always be the wisest or the smartest. I might do some silly things, put my foot in my mouth at times, but I'm always willing to do what God calls me to. Denying Christ is not me. I'm just going to stick with it, whatever. But Jesus said, no, you will deny me. And then when he did, he must have been crushed by this. I can't believe I did that to Jesus. I can't believe I turned my back on everything I believe and everything I've given my life for. And it's too late now to do anything about it. What's done is done. It's just too late. And that bitterness of feeling like I would give anything to be able to take back the last 5 minutes, the last 15 minutes. I would give anything for that, but I can't take them back. They happened. And at that point, that's where the next verses really resonate. Now, these next verses are something that Jesus said earlier to Peter, but I just want you to notice it. I think they probably didn't connect for him until this moment. Jesus had said to him, after telling him he was going to deny him, and hearing Peter say, no, I would never deny you, Jesus said to him, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. But I prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and you, when once you've turned again, strengthen your brothers. There's so much here that I'm not going to get into detail on. The Simon, Simon shows Jesus' tender concern for Peter as a person. Satan has demanded permission is weird. Why would Satan be able to demand permission? It reminds me of the first chapter of Job, where Satan wants to test Job and God agrees. For some reason, even though Satan demanded, I don't think God had to agree, but he did agree here. And so Jesus is praying for Peter, and the Father's telling him he is going to deny me. Don't pray that he won't deny me, because he is going to deny me. And it says it's going to sift Peter like wheat. When you sift wheat, you're sorting out the wheat from the chaff, the good part from the bad part. And Peter thought his not denying Jesus, he was confident of that because he only saw good. I'm a guy who trusts Jesus and who will do whatever it takes. And Satan sifted him and pulled out in him the very worst parts of his being. And he saw that he was not nearly as strong a follower as he thought. He saw that he was a coward and a traitor, and it just broke him. But then it says, I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. This is the weird thing. Jesus didn't pray that Peter wouldn't deny him because he knew that would happen. So that's not what he means by your faith not failing. What he prayed for was that after denying him, he would get back up again and keep trusting. And that's this moment when Peter went out and wept bitterly. Judas went out and wept bitterly and gave up his life, hung himself. But Peter wept bitterly, and then Jesus called him back to fellowship just a few days later after the resurrection. So, and Jesus prayed for him at this moment that his faith would not fail. And then he's so confident, he says, when you've once turned again, strengthen your brothers. I will still have a ministry for you. So I love the idea that Peter completely collapsed in his faith. And Jesus says, I'm praying you back. I'm praying you back. I don't want your faith to fail. And this is kind of what he did for Abram. Yes, you blew it in Egypt, Abram, but I want you to come back. I'm the restorer of your walk with me. Faith is about persistence. It's about starting over as often as necessary. Proverbs says a righteous man falls 7 times and rises again, but the wicked stumble in time of calamity. We will go through times in our lives when we disappoint ourselves bitterly and disappoint our sense of ourselves and do things that are betrayals of Jesus. But he's always ready to forgive and to bring us back and to say to us, get up again, you'll keep moving, because my work in you is longer term than this. I haven't given up on you. You shouldn't give up on what I'm doing either. Somebody said to me once, a long time ago, Kevin, there's no end to the number of new beginnings you can have with God. And that was very helpful for me to see, and it's thoroughly biblical. Okay, so that's Christ our restorer. What I would like to ask you, to challenge you with is there a place for you where this is relevant? There may not be, but if there is, do you need Christ to restore you to faith with him? Is there some area of your life where you once were believing and now you've forgotten? Where once you were worshiping him and surrendering to him and now you've moved away from it and you realize you need to get back? Well, the good news is Christ is the restorer of our relationships. He's the restorer of our faith. He's the restorer of our walk with him. And he can and will restore you to him if you just will surrender to it. And so if that's the case, I challenge you to reach out and take advantage of that. And if you're not in that place, just rejoice in it and walk and arise and walk and see all that he's promised us in Christ. And I will see you next week.